It says preparing right now, but I've got the live icon.
Okay. My phone just gave me a thing saying Historian on Tap is live.
Good.
Yeah, we got people watching.
Now they know that we know they're watching.
We know you're watching. John Heckman's watching.
Hey, John!
Hi, John.
Tattooed historian in the house.
Hope you're feeling better.
Yeah. Lay off the Mountain Dew, dude. Dew and coffee, I don't know.
Well, all right, it looks like we are live on the Loudoun Museums page and with Mosby Heritage Area, so we can go ahead and get started. How you doing, everyone? My name is Joe Rizzo. I am with the Loudoun Museum, and what this is History on Tap. And as usual, I am joined by Anne-Marie Paquette of the Mosby Heritage Area, Travis Shaw with the Mosby Heritage Area, and our guest tonight is Jake Wynn with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine.
Yay!
Good job, Anne-Marie. Some good confidence there. So this is History on Tap. This is a program that we started several months ago where we would go to breweries throughout Northern Virginia. We would pick various topics pertaining to local history. We would take questions from the audience. We would keep it pretty casual and talk about some weird, serious, interesting history and get some of the audience feedback as well. We had tonight scheduled to be at Harper's Ferry, our next program. We were going to look at the history of Harper's Ferry and the Potomac River. Unfortunately, because of some obvious circumstances, we can't do that at Harper's Ferry tonight, but we are planning absolutely to reschedule that at Harper's Ferry. And for that program, we're going to be joined by Rich Condon of Civil War Pittsburgh. And we look forward to bringing that to Harper's Ferry as soon as we get the clearance to do so. But in the interim, we figured that we still enjoy chatting with history together. We still enjoy drinking good local beer. So we figured we would open it up, do a live stream, change the topics and start bringing this live so you can comment on questions that you might have, comment on our material. We want to know what you're drinking, where you're coming from, and what your questions are as we go throughout doing this. So I want to quick again let everyone introduce what they're going to be talking about briefly and what they're drinking. And what I'm going to focus on tonight in particularly is the influenza pandemic of 1918. And what I am drinking tonight is from Vanish Brewery in Leesburg, Virginia, and I'm drinking their wit beer. Anne-Marie, what do you got going on?
So I'll be talking cholera. There were 6 major epidemics in United States history. I'll be focusing on 2 between the years of 1829 and about 1850. And then tonight on tap, I have Herbacious Spaces from Crooked Run Brewery. And this is a fun beer. Not just because it tastes great, but it's also a partnership beer produced with Wheatland Spring in Wheatland, Virginia, just near Warrenton. So it's kind of a double hitter as far as a heritage area beer. And I'm drinking out of my Mosby Heritage Area koozie as well. So definitely trying to get all the points for that tonight in the middle of the program.
Travis, what is it that you're drinking from Old Ox while we wait to see clearance of his back? And we are back on Facebook Live, it looks like.
Black Ox, which is their rye porter. It's really, really tasty. I'm not much of a dark beer guy, but I could drink this all day. It's fantastic.
Awesome. We are back. So Jake, could you again mention what you're what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about Civil War epidemics, disease outbreaks during the Civil War. I'm going to be drinking some Sawbones, which is brewed in partnership with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and Flying Dog Brewery. Rocking my Phillies hat because I'm super bummed that opening day for baseball has been postponed indefinitely. And also rocking a t-shirt for Old Forester Distillery down in Louisville, Kentucky, which is named in honor of a Union surgeon during the Civil War.
Wow. All right. You got a lot of apparel there. So I know we just went dark for a little bit. So I just want to give a recap of what we're doing again. This is History on Tap. We are trying it virtually. This is our first time doing so, but we wanted to do this live so we can get your feedback. So as you're watching, again, we want to know, if you're joining us for a good beer or a local brewery, let us know what you're drinking. If you have questions, we've got Andrea on the Loudoun Museum team who's watching for your questions in the comment section. We've got stat guy Mike who's going to look up things that we don't know during it. So we are here for you. We don't script any of this. We're pretty casual in how this goes about. We've got our stories, but then we kind of jump in when we need to as well. So we might as well go and get started, and we're going to go chronologically for the most part. So Travis, what is it again that you're going to be talking about? And let's get into it.
So I'm going to be talking about the Great Smallpox epidemic that lasted from 1775 until about 1782-83. So pretty much slots in perfectly with the same period that the American Revolutionary War is going to be fought. And this epidemic is going to have a huge impact on the war itself. Now, smallpox, thankfully, is a disease we don't have to deal with anymore. It was pretty much, it's been eradicated in the wild. But before that, it was a tremendous, tremendous killer. The rate of death with smallpox, fatality rate, is about 30%. So you can see how it could very quickly overwhelm communities, overwhelm families. Now that number jumps up exponentially higher here in North America. We know that smallpox was brought by the Spanish in the early parts of the 16th century, and it is going to have an absolutely devastating effect on Native Americans. And that's kind of, I think, what we typically associate it with. I mean, we're talking death rates of 80, 90%, something that those communities, their descendants are still kind of grappling with. Archaeologists and historians are still really trying to wrap their heads around the magnitude of that. But even if you are coming from Europe, you're a colonist, even then your chances of dying if you contract smallpox are pretty high. It's a devastating disease. Now, what makes this particular epidemic in the late 18th century so deadly is it does happen during wartime. This epidemic begins just shortly after the battles of Lexington and Concord. We don't know exactly where it starts. But what we do know is by the winter of 1775, many, many places up and down the east coast of the colonies are being ravaged by this epidemic. And it makes sense. I mean, I'm sure Jake and you, Joe, are going to be talking about when we're in a wartime situation, people are moving around from place to place. People are packed together in, very, very concentrated areas. Sanitation is not the best. And so it's a challenge that both armies are going to face during the Revolution. And it's a challenge that, like I said, really, I think, I'm going to hot take here, changes the course of the Revolution in several ways.
Can we get a hot take? Do you have that queued up, Joe?
So we were talking about various things we can do. So we definitely need to give some hot takes. So if we go throughout this and I hear something that's a little too extreme, you're going to get shut down by the hot take horn. If it gets too hot, we're going to cool you off and silence you for a little bit and move on. But I think we can keep going with what you just said.
All right, so hear me out.
Explain the ridiculous take.
We're going to focus real tight on Virginia here for a second. November 1775, Lord Dunmore issues his famous proclamation offering freedom to enslaved people who fight for the British. And thousands, probably about 2,000 or so enslaved people will take him up on that offer. Here's the issue. Dunmore, these formerly enslaved people, his followers, are driven from Norfolk. They're living on ships in the Chesapeake Bay. They call it this floating town. So you can imagine 80 or 90 vessels of different sizes, people packed on board these ships for weeks at a time, months at a time. Once that smallpox epidemic hits these people, it is absolutely devastating. There's eyewitness accounts that talk about like bodies being thrown from the ships daily, so much so that sharks are following the floating town up and down the Chesapeake Bay. Dunmore's going to try to land on first in Portsmouth, then up at Gwynn's Island, St. George's Island. He's going to land at different places throughout the Chesapeake, try to establish hospitals, try to get some respite from this epidemic. But what it ends up doing is basically devastates the forces that he's depending on to retain royal control of Virginia. So had this epidemic not wiped out the bulk of his forces, the course of the revolution in Virginia could have gone very, very differently. But what it does is it completely not only saps his force in terms of manpower, but also morale. So that this epidemic is one of the key factors in forcing Lord Dunmore out of Virginia and giving up royal control over Virginia. Now, on the opposite side of things, we go north a little ways up to Boston, the British that are being besieged in Boston at this time, smallpox is tearing through the town there. Again, everyone's kind of cramped together. But smallpox is also going to affect Washington's army. Many of these men have grown up on farms, small villages. A lot of them are younger guys who've never been exposed to smallpox before. And so the danger is recognized very, very quickly by Washington, by many other leaders at the time. And so what Washington is going to implement is nothing short of, dare I say, revolutionary. The first, it's really going to be one of the first widespread inoculations, or what they call variolations, in American history. And for anyone who's anybody seen the John Adams series on HBO, you've seen this in like gory detail. What they do is they find someone who is coming out of surviving a smallpox infection. They take material from the pox itself, from the blisters, like pus and other material, and then they scratch the skin and put that in there. Now, that's a terrifying thing. You can see why this, like a lot of people in the 18th century have a hard time wrapping their heads around this, because you're literally taking a healthy person and deliberately exposing them to something that they know causes disease. Even though they don't understand germ theory, they know this is a really stupid sounding thing, at least on the surface. But Washington will establish camps within his army. They're going to basically inoculate the majority of the army, anyone who hasn't been exposed to this deadly disease. And what happens is some people do get sick and die, but the rate of death drops to it's like 2% versus, like I said before, like 20 to 30%. So it does end up being incredibly effective, and it's one of those things that allows Washington to keep his army in the field. As a counterpoint, Washington's doing this with his army around Cambridge and outside Boston. The army that's up north invading Canada basically walks smack dab into the middle of this epidemic, and they lose hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men as they retreat back into New York State. So the difference is really, really amazing. Washington is a big proponent of this. He had survived smallpox as a young man, so he knew what the disease could do. Martha Washington will get inoculated. Of course, John and Abigail Adams will. And it's really seeing these leaders, these people who are kind of seen as figureheads and very popular public figures, that convinces a lot of Americans that this is the right thing to do. Now, what happens from there? I mean, it gets even wilder. This disease, again, it lasts 8 years. This epidemic will sweep up and down the East Coast. Basically, wherever the armies go, you see it falls particularly hard on African Americans. A lot of, again, African Americans who are seeking freedom with the British Army will be struck very hard at Yorktown, down in the Carolinas. Thousands will die. But from there, it just goes absolutely epidemic. Continent-wide, you'll see it pops up in New Orleans, which is controlled by the Spanish at the time. From there, it passes to Mexico. Tens of thousands will die in Mexico. It sweeps up through the Great Plains, through like the Shoshone and the Mandan Indians. So much so that when Lewis and Clark traveled through that area like 25 years later, they're still like this tremendous memory of this epidemic that had swept through like a generation before. It even reaches as far as Alaska and over into Siberia. So like Russian traders in Alaska take it back to the old world. So it's really, as I said, one of the first well-recorded epidemics in American history, but certainly one that had a tremendous influence on the American Revolution. So.
I've got a question, and then Joel Christensen on Facebook asked about the British Army, whether they're doing inoculations. I'll ask my question after that one, if you know anything about that, or Jake.
So the British Army does, by and large, a lot of the soldiers fighting in the British Army and the Germans, auxiliaries who are over there with them, have grown up in a culture where they're a little more resistant, because a lot of them are coming from more, densely settled areas. They've been exposed to it earlier in life. So Washington actually notes he's like the British are more resistant to this, but they will try inoculations. One of the things Lord Dunmore actually tried to do on Gwynn's Island was set up hospitals to inoculate like these formerly enslaved people. So it's certainly something that the British are doing, but I don't think the need isn't recognized.
Am I wrong? Like, it's not, smallpox is more like a childhood thing in Britain, right? It's not as like a epidemic that spreads as much as it is in North America. Am I wrong on that?
No, I'm not necessarily a smallpox expert, but from what I've read on the period, yeah, it tends to be something that it goes through families. It tends to strike children very hard. I'm trying to think. I read somewhere I think it was in Sweden, they said it killed like 1 out of every 5 children or 1 out of every 4 children during this period. So, but it is something that you do have a lifelong immunity to. So, it certainly it was a much more frequent disease in Europe than it was here, mostly just based on proximity. It requires pretty intimate contact to pass back and forth between people, or pretty close contact. So the more densely populated the area is, the more frequently it would happen. So, I don't know, Jake, do you have any sort of insight on smallpox?
Just that's a good preview of what is going to happen during the Civil War.
Yeah, you get all these farm boys out of like Minnesota and like Iowa that have never been around people before, right?
Yeah.
It's really, it does make me thankful for modern medicine that it's not something we have to face nowadays.
I'll cheers to
I'll drink to that.
Yeah.
You were going to ask something though, Joe.
Well, I was going to make a comment. Like, I think particularly in New England, there seems to be a pushback towards inoculation. Is that mostly like, am I correct that like they saw it more like a heathen kind of thing? Like I read that Native Americans, African Americans were taking part in this too. So particularly in more religious New England, they saw this being like, this seems like an un-Christian thing to do.
So there is, when this process of variolation first starts to become kind of mainstream in North America and in kind of British America in general, is in the early part of the 1700s. And you do see like a little bit of pushback. Cotton Mather actually writes about it, that it's like kind of this unnatural thing to do. And I think maybe that plays a part in it. I think it's a very human reaction though, to be afraid of something. I mean, you could draw parallels to a lot of the modern anti-vaccine movement today. Like the concept of shooting a healthy person full of something that at least, theoretically makes you ill, is pretty scary. And as I said, it was not a foolproof process. People did die from this. Even people who got minor infections, there was a fear that they might leave the camp, go walk into town, and then infect people with a much more serious infection. So I think that's a huge part of it.
Perfect. And one more quick question before you cut you off. What's the best thing to read if you want to read more about smallpox and the revolution? Do you have a book, something like that?
There is a definitive book about this epidemic. I have it sitting here because I was flipping through it earlier today.
Nerd.
Pax Americana. Great book. Really details this entire epidemic from start to finish, not just the Revolutionary War aspect of it, but the entire kind of continent-wide impact of it. Also a really good discussion of the disease itself. Again, it's not a disease we face often. So it's not a disease I personally knew a whole lot about before I started researching this stuff. So very much recommend this book.
Perfect.
Maybe not now, maybe wait a little while to read it, but
yeah, I feel like I need a lot of hand sanitizer after listening to all this. It's not going to get better from here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you're right. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. So I'll be talking about cholera, and I want to start with a shout out to all of my family members who are currently blowing up my phone. Thank you, but I'm busy right now. Thanks for watching. And yes, Mom, this is a bring your own beer situation. So I'm going to start off. So cholera had been around for a little while before it reached the United States in 1829. The disease actually originated in Bengal, India, in the early 19th century. So it was often called the Asiatic cholera because of that, because it's coming from, you know, the Far East in that time. So in 1829, 1830, it starts spreading across Europe. So from India, it goes to Hungary, Russia, Paris, Egypt, London, and then inevitably it makes its way over to the US. Actually, it goes to Canada first before it arrives in ports in New England. And one thing that a lot of physicians from the era, they note that it follows trade routes. So they do not believe that it's transmitted from person to person necessarily, but they do notice that it occurs along trade routes and where we have large groups of populations together. As Travis mentioned, so one being in military action, you've got a lot of people clustered together. And even in peacetime, you have large cities, you have a lot of these settlements. When you're thinking about American culture at this time and global culture, a lot of our towns and settlements are along waterways. They're on rivers, they're on creeks, they're on navigable streams, places like that. And so not only is cholera quickly associated with these trade routes populations, but they're also associated with kind of riverine settlements and towns. So it arrives in New York first in 1830 and then kind of trickles its way down the East Coast before it arrives here. And the disease is really pretty awful and fast. So smallpox, you know, we talked a little bit about what it was about. Cholera, what would happen is the first sign that you had cholera was, as they put it very delicately, is you would void your bowels pretty emphatically. And then after that, that was your warning shot, because after that you would be voiding your bowels and vomiting, you know, at the same time, again, very violently. And then the third stage of the disease was that you would collapse. They called it sinking. So you would collapse. A lot of people would lose their consciousness at this point, and then you would die unless you survived. And all of these stages could happen in as little as 3-4 hours. So you often see when communities get hit by cholera, it's lightning fast. And oftentimes, you know, these individuals might not even know what they're dealing with before they're literally on their deathbed. So it's a very scary, very sudden disease. And it's not pretty. And that's one thing that culture at the time seizes on too. In France, this is called the mort de chien, which means a dog's death, because it's gross. You know, this is very far from that Victorian idea of a noble death. Even if you're dying from a disease in Victorian times, there's this thought that you would waste away and there would be dignity to it. And this is not a dignified way to die. And so a lot of people are afraid of this, but they quickly seize on the fact that this looks like it's kind of a classist disease. So when the disease enters into these populated areas, it's going to attack the lower ends of society first. So in England, for example, a lot of mining communities are hit very hard because they're low income, there's low sanitation, everyone's living on top of each other. In America, and especially in Virginia, you're going to see enslaved populations succumbing to cholera first. And because of that, some of the white residents decide that, oh, this is a disease that only affects people who are morally and socially inferior to myself. So there are actually a couple of interesting notes here that I have. For example, in Boston, there was a reverend said that this is a disease that's a punishment for intemperance, which I think was especially fitting to bring up tonight when we're all drinking beer. So to intemperance.
Yeah, intemperance.
Show them.
But not only that, when in 1832, the disease is really coming to Washington, D.C. and is also in Norfolk. In Richmond, they have a couple of cases there. But the first case they note in September of 1832, it's the death of an 11-year-old enslaved boy. So someone who's not important to Richmond society. And they're very quick to say that he had a weak constitution and had eaten imprudently of pears before he came down with cholera. So they're deciding that he deserved, to catch cholera rather than ascribing it to something in his environment. In a similar way, shortly later, the Richmond Enquirer says that a 55-year-old enslaved woman whose name was Dorcas, she succumbed to cholera as well. But again, the Enquirer was quick to point out that this was someone who had gross habits and who was recently known to have eaten fried meat and cheese all together. So if eating fried meat and cheese all together is a death sentence, then I'm long overdue.
America's
I know, it's all over. Sorry, guys. So that's what we see in the 1830s is a very serious disease. There are hundreds of people dying, but there's this really poor understanding of where it comes from. There's a thought in the same way that you had with smallpox and other fevers that miasma or bad air is causing this disease. It's something in the air and it's coming from putrid trash. It's coming from wastewater, but it's not because of anything endemic to those things. It's just stagnant air, that's causing this. And so it's the same thing in the 1829 to 1832 cholera pandemic, when physicians, spiritual leaders, political leaders are all saying, this is something that you're especially susceptible to if you are intemperate, if you have nasty habits, if you're dirty, and if you're not, if you're not clean and you're not morally clean, you will probably get this disease. And so their treatments of this were equally, kind of confused. You have conflicting reports. Some doctors are saying opium, just give them a bunch of opium to relax the system and maybe they won't die. Another thought is you pump them full of chalk mercury, which is to stimulate producing moisture in your body because you're losing all of your body's moisture through your profuse evacuations.
I love how mercury is just like the cure for everything wrong.
It is, though. It is. It's either you take your mercury, you take your opium, and then this crazy person in New York started writing about, well, if you inject the body with saline solution, your blood has a chance to replenish itself and you might have a better chance of living. But they don't listen to him. It's opium or, it's mercury. Sometimes both, but rarely neither. And there was one other, my favorite remedy, the one that I think was most interesting, is this idea that don't give them the mercury orally because the body will reject it. So the idea is you get this chalk mercury and cayenne powder and you rub it all over the sick person. This did not work as I understand it, but it was very interesting the way that they're trying their older methods.
That's awful,
and...
but it's better than where I thought that was gonna go. So
okay, yeah, that's a good point. There were no cayenne pepper suppositories involved. Yeah, it was topical only. So eventually, of course, cholera kind of runs its course, but it comes back, about 15 years later, from 1849 to 1852, it returns to the United States. And at first, when outbreaks are being reported in, again, these urban centers, it's being treated much the same way. Like, it's a moral thing. You know, if you're a clean person, it won't affect you. Which on one hand partially works if you have a clean environment, if you clean your clothes, if you clean your body, you may be less susceptible. If you make sure your food is clean, you'll be less susceptible to cholera. That's true science. But in 1850, it actually takes the death of Zachary Taylor for a lot of people to take it seriously. And so it's in August of 1850 that President Zachary Taylor dies, and people think that it's from cholera. We no longer think that, but in 1850 they did. And so they said, if the president can die of cholera, it really could get anybody. But again, the papers are trying to paint it as the fault of the individual. They don't try and say Taylor was a nasty person. What they do say was, unfortunately, again, direct quote, unfortunately, he had eaten a lot of vegetables. And that's why he died. So you see these papers suggesting, don't stop eating vegetables, stop eating fruits, especially cucumbers. Cucumbers are the worst thing you can eat right now. The thought being that somehow these raw fruits or vegetables were bad, but they didn't quite understand that it probably came from if you were washing your fruits or vegetables with an infected water. So they didn't mean it to work, but that advice might have worked, to help people. So President Zachary Taylor dies. People are freaking out, but there is kind of an interesting spin to this. In 1849, before it had hit Washington, D.C., you had a lot of reports of cholera getting closer to the capital. So you've got Point of Rocks in Maryland, where they start reporting cases. Then you have Harper's Ferry, where in a population of about 1,700 people, you have about 100 people dying of cholera. That's a high percentage for Harper's Ferry. So you have people coming on passenger trains that won't stick their head out the window. They don't want to breathe the air outside of the train car. And if they're stopping in Harper's Ferry, they literally run from the station to wherever it is they're trying to get to, like trying to spend as little time in the town as possible. And it's actually really interesting that at this time, by the time it's in Harper's Ferry, it's later in the summertime, March of 1851, they petition for official township with the state of Virginia. So of course, before this, as the National Armory, Harper's Ferry had been in control of the military, of the government. In the beginning of 1851, they successfully petitioned to have their own town charter, and it's so they can establish a sanitary commission. So Harper's Ferry was actually chartered as a town thanks to cholera, which you would not think of. But it's in have their town council, they have a sanitary commission whose job it is to go in and clean up the streets and try to wash away all of this miasma, all of this filth and dirt that's accumulated in the town. So we have cholera to thank for Harper's Ferry. That's my positive spin. It's a spin zone.
It was going to be that we have a reason not to eat vegetables, but
yeah,
So,
it's also a great reason not to eat vegetables.
Right.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Before we move,
I'm not done yet. I'm close, but
Okay.
I'm not done yet. Okay. So, I know Travis, he's going to chime in for a second, but I want to make sure I end with my toast before I move on to Jake. So, one person that we really have to credit for halting the spread of cholera was someone who was not really recognized at the time, but in 1849, a Dr. John Snow in England was able to trace one localized batch of cholera back to an infected pump, a water pump. And by disabling the pump, he then, they saw a drastic drop in cases of cholera in that area. And it clicked for a lot of people, not automatically, but that water, infected water, contaminated water was the source of this disease. Travis, do you want to tell us more about Dr. John Snow?
you know where this is going.
No. I was just gonna say, before we move on, since you brought up some of the amazing treatments that they had come up with,
Yeah.
maybe share some of our favorite period treatments for diseases.
So that was one, but I do have another treatment that's not for people, but I think is a lot of fun.
Okay.
So jumping on that. So I read this. It was a farrier's book from the 18th century, and they had a lot of veterinary advice. And one was a cure for melancholy. If your horse was melancholy, this was something you could do. And maybe it works. You can extrapolate it for people. But
Your horse was
is,
depressed?
Yeah, basically. Lethargic, depressed, just not looking the way you should. The key, the cure is a red onion suppository to be applied in whole as a suppository. So if anyone out there is feeling melancholy, I just want you to consider that remedy.
Oh,
I didn't think we were going there. But
yeah. Oh.
can we toast Jon Snow at least? I thought that's what we were going to do.
Yeah, we can toast to Jon Snow, but I have an additional toast that we can combine with it. So in 1832, in Waterford, Virginia, this is during the first outbreak of cholera, there's a local meeting of elected officials on the 4th of July, and they're going around and they're toasting each other, and it's in the middle of this pandemic, and it's an election year, and Mr. S.C. Dorman proposes a toast: may a beneficent providence equally avert the cholera and the re-election of Jackson. And so that's an official toast.
Here.
All right, Jake, you expand on cholera here. What's going on now when the Civil War starts?
So we talked about cholera, we talked about smallpox. So the Civil War is kind of a combination of all 19th century diseases in one place.
Okay.
And luckily, fortunately, cholera is going to hold off until the very end of the conflict, until 1865 and 1866. And we are going to learn some really valuable lessons during the Civil War about cholera, about the spread of disease, and Anne-Marie mentioned sanitary commissions. That is going to help us deal with cholera at the end of the Civil War. So when the Civil War breaks out in 1861, America and the world really is at a kind of crossroads when it comes to the understanding of medicine. You know, what is medicine? Is it the old ways, the heroic age of medicine with the idea of 4 humors in the body? This is where you're doing things like bleeding, where you're doing leeches, that sort of thing to restore balance to the body. Fortunately, by the mid-19th century, this is on its way out. So the idea of bleedings, the idea of leeches, that's mostly gone by the time that the Civil War breaks out. There's still lots of different competing theories about what causes disease, what causes the infection. And the Civil War is really going to help to settle a lot of these arguments. Now, going into the conflict, as Anne-Marie mentioned, there is a theory about miasmas, bad air, that is going to be responsible for the spread of disease in this time period. This theory has some validity today in the idea that disease can be spread through the air from person to person, but they did not necessarily make that connection. 19th century doctors, they were thinking more about bad smells. So think like sewage, think rotting food, in some cases decomposing bodies of both animals and, during the Civil War, as frequently as seen, humans. That's the idea that most doctors have in the 19th century about the origins of many of the diseases that are going to be faced. Now, when the Civil War breaks out, there are going to be large masses of communities of men, of soldiers initially, that are going to come together. And as Travis mentioned earlier about rural populations, think like soldiers coming in from Minnesota and Wisconsin, who have lived on a farm or out in a logging camp all of their life. Suddenly they're going to be thrown into small, relatively small army camps with large numbers of men. This is going to lead to the spread of a huge quantity of different kinds of disease. And the Civil War is going to be a really, truly unprecedented medical conflict, because you're seeing all of these diseases coming into the same place at the same time. So among the first outbreaks that you're going to see, things like measles, things like chickenpox are going to spread through these army camps among young soldiers coming in from the hinterlands who have never been exposed to these diseases. And so many of them are going to be dying in droves of measles, of chickenpox, of other what we would consider childhood diseases. These soldiers are going to be very susceptible. These rural populations are going to be very susceptible to those diseases. As the conflict begins to move forward and men are living in these ever larger communities of soldiers, you're going to see the spread of different kinds of disease. In the first year of the Civil War here in Washington, D.C., I always like to use the example of typhoid fever. So as the Union and Confederate armies are gathering a Union army in the vicinity of Washington, you're going to end up with 70 to 100,000 men living in army camps surrounding the nation's capital. And then just 20 miles down the road, around Manassas, you have another large Confederate force that is going to be gathering and creating defenses and camping out for the winter. They have tens of thousands of soldiers. This means is that men living in close quarters together with poor sanitation. There is no infrastructure to deal with all of these men living in the same space. And sanitary conditions are horrendous. And so what this means is you're going to be dealing with a lot of contaminated water, because inevitably water sources that these men are going to be required to drink from are going to be the same water sources that the sewage from these camps is going to run off into. Now, there is an understanding that you don't want to drink the same water from your latrines, where your latrine is dumping into. But in many cases, these army camps are placed in such a way that you have no choice. because you might be getting a clean water source, what you think is a clean water source, but there's another Army camp upstream that is dumping their sewage into the water that is coming down, and you are drinking that. Now, this not only impacts the soldier populations in the camps around Washington, but also the civilian population. You see that in the first winter of the Civil War with a typhoid fever epidemic in the city of Washington that is going to impact not only soldiers, but also the civilian population as well, going right up into the White House itself. And Abraham Lincoln is going to lose a son, Willie, to typhoid fever during that first winter of the conflict. And this is as a result of this contaminated water that Washingtonians are drinking, that the soldiers are drinking. And this is going to be one of the biggest killers of soldiers during the Civil War. Another one is dysentery, diarrhea. Diarrhea kills more soldiers than just about any other ailment during the conflict. And that is as a result of this contaminated water sources, or nutrition, all is going to come together for these soldiers and is going to kill a huge number of soldiers, both in the Union Army and in the Confederate Army. Now, for both of these diseases, treatments, we talked quite a bit about mercury already, but mercury comes back.
Oh boy.
Yeah, everyone loves their, as they called it in the Civil War, the blue pill. And so mercury is going to be one of the most commonly given medications during the Civil War. And this dates back to that heroic age of medicine. And so medicine has not quite gotten to full-on scientific evidence-based medicine yet. There are still some hangers-on from older periods. And so luckily bleeding has gone away, but purging the body still there. And so purging, this idea that you have something in your body, a substance that is causing you to feel ill, causing you to have a fever, to have diarrhea, you must force that out of your body.
Everything, get it all out.
Dump it out.
All out.
And so mercury is going to be given in many cases for these kinds of illnesses, dysentery, diarrhea, for typhoid specifically. Typhoid is going to see a lot of these kinds of treatments with mercury. And the idea is flush it out.
Is this like a juice cleanse kind of item? Is that where
the worst juice cleanse ever? So mercury is going to be used in millions of doses during the war. As the conflict goes on, there are some surgeons within the Union Army specifically that are going to say, hey, we've noticed that it seems like a lot of patients that are given mercury end up dying. We should probably stop using mercury. One of the biggest proponents is the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, a guy named William Hammond. William Hammond, after proposing this, as well as arguing with the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, don't ever argue with Edwin Stanton, he is court-martialed from the Union Army and forced out in disgrace. The idea that mercury kind of flushes your system, that never goes away truly during the Civil War. And mercury is used as a treatment for various ailments well into the 20th century. It never really goes away. But it was given in such high quantities during the Civil War that it caused some major issues. Another medication that is used for these kinds of diseases, as Anne-Marie mentioned, is opium as well. And this is used specifically with dysentery and diarrhea because opium plugs you up. It actually helps to stop some of the diarrhea that you would be having. Causes, in some cases, severe constipation. And so opium was being given for those purposes, as well as its pain relief qualities as well.
So I've heard, you guys have probably heard this too, the idea that everything can be solved with either WD-40 or duct tape. Would opium and mercury be the medical versions of that?
Yeah, they pretty much show up all the time forever. So, yeah.
Jake, so we talked about treatment, but like they have to be asking, why are all these troops, when they get close to each other, getting all these diseases? And like they obviously don't know about germs. So what are they saying is causing this?
So the miasmatic theory, the idea of miasmas, bad smell spreading disease, is the chief what they blame these disease outbreaks on. And actually, it does make some sense. Think about this. If you're placing an army camp, are you going to put it in a swamp? Probably not. And the idea that they have is that this swampy areas are breeding grounds for disease. They don't necessarily understand why. They are connecting things like bad smells, malaria, or mosquito infested areas with disease. And so they are making some connections, but they don't get all the way to where they need to be to understand how disease is spreading. Now, I do want to go back just quickly back to the disease that Travis talked in depth about, and that is smallpox. And smallpox is by far the most feared disease amongst these armies during the Civil War. Union and Confederate forces are terrified about smallpox. And that is because they understand that it spreads quickly from person to person. They don't understand how, but they do understand that it is spread quickly through tight enclosed populations, like an army camp. And so they are doing inoculations during the war. This has some negative byproducts. One of those negative byproducts is that soldiers are so scared of this that they're doing self-inoculation. They're not waiting for their surgeon to do it. They're doing it themselves. And in some cases, they are spreading syphilis from soldier to soldier by doing these self-inoculations. They're sharing the knives that they are doing these inoculations with. And this causes outbreaks of syphilis. They're also spreading syphilis many other ways as well through these armies. And it's so feared that these soldiers are going to that step to do self-inoculation because they're so terrified of smallpox. Another example I just want to touch briefly on is the famous Civil War regiment, the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry. Going into the Battle of Chancellorsville in the spring of 1863, the 20th Maine actually misses out on that battle because they are quarantined. So they are doing things like quarantine during the Civil War because they understand that with smallpox specifically, that this is a disease that can be easily communicated amongst these small army populations. And so they separate out the 20th Maine due to a failed smallpox inoculation. Someone in that unit got a full case of smallpox and quickly spread it to more than 90 members of the regiment. And so that unit is actually separated out and moved into its own camp in order to prevent it from spreading to the rest of the population. The reason I bring this up, in addition to the 20th Maine, a lot of press about the Civil War, is also because I'm not a big fan of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So hot take, alarm. Get it? Yeah. So, but Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain has a great line when he's trying to get his unit into battle during Chancellorsville. Ultimately, he is unsuccessful, but he tells the Army Chief of Staff, Dan Butterfield, he's like, by God, at least we can give the Confederates smallpox. We can't, and it's just a great line, you know, it's just a great line. But disease, warfare. Yeah, biological warfare indeed. And so Civil War, just in general, there are some big successes that are going to be made. They do begin to understand, in some cases, how some diseases are spread and some ways to possibly prevent that. They clean up army camps as the war goes on. But disease is the #1 killer of Civil War soldiers, as was commonly the case during the 19th century and in previous conflicts going back to the beginning of time itself, is that when you put these populations of soldiers together with civilian populations, diseases spread rapidly and quickly and cause mass casualties. So during the Civil War, 2/3 of those that die in the conflict die not of bullets or shells, but of disease. But there is a positive, and that is that when cholera comes back to the United States at the end of the Civil War in 1865 and 1866, American populations, especially in the North, especially in New York City, prepared. And they have learned lessons from the Civil War about cleaning up those camps. They're going to, during the Civil War, going to clean up their neighborhoods in New York in 1866, and they are going to focus on learning the lessons from John Snow. They are going to apply those lessons, and they are going to ensure that when cholera comes back to New York in 1866, it is going to have a far lower death toll than you see in previous outbreaks of cholera in the United States.
I like that. Let's also not forget that the treatment for syphilis is mercury.
More
Mercury back
More
again.
mercury.
So it's great that you mentioned, like sanitation in camps, because it's something that Washington's also dealing with during the Revolution, and it brings to mind there's specific orders when the army's around New York in 1776, where again you've got these farm boys who don't really know what they're doing, are using the same trenches they're digging to like defend as their latrines. And so like Washington and officers are telling these guys like literally like don't go to the bathroom there.
Stop it.
Stop.
Stop.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a problem that armies seem to have to face every time there's another conflict, is like training people to use basic sanitation. So.
Well, I've got some bad news. It doesn't get much better when we get into the 20s. I have been trying to find some positives here. We'll maybe get a couple. But I mean, all those things we talk about from the 1700s, the 1800s, I probably don't think it's coincidental that a lot of these issues really come to a head during times of war. Obviously, societies are mobilizing. You have people in close quarters. And you see a lot of that with the influenza epidemic in 1918. And you really can't understand this flu, which is getting a lot of press. I see it in a lot of contemporary articles referencing back to 1918. And you can't really understand what happens in that year without realizing, again, that the world is at war, and a size of war that you haven't seen really in human history in terms of mobilization and slaughter that's going on over in France. And for the United States in particular, they're not in the war when it begins in 1914. But after a couple of years in, you see the Woodrow Wilson administration get approval for war and start mobilizing in the latter half of it. And when you're mobilizing for war quickly, it means you're taking in a lot of recruits, you're changing industry for war, and then you've got to train them before heading them over into the European front of it. Now, as you all know, like the seasonal flu is still around now. It was common then, and it targeted the people that you typically suspect, those with pre-existing conditions and the elderly. That's gonna be one of the several things that are different for what takes place in 1918. But you can't really understand this flu without, again, looking at the war, in particular within the United States. And when you get so many of these troops volunteering for it, they're then going to different forts throughout the country. And like most pandemics, there's mystery behind what causes it and where it starts. But there's a lot of evidence to show that it starts at Fort Riley, Kansas, or at least is really one of the first documented cases of it. And it's from a private named Albert Gitchell, who is at Fort Riley, Kansas, and he becomes a cook for the Army. Now, there's one guy you don't want coming down with a bad disease. It's probably the one who's touching literally every soldier's meals. But in early March 1918, he checks in a morning in early March with sore throat, aches, fever, headache. And by the afternoon in that same day, over 100 soldiers checked into the infirmary with similar symptoms. So that started a red flag that something was going on pretty early on in Kansas. But it's not just in Kansas where these are happening. At Fort Grant, throughout the Midwest, in Illinois, Fort in Massachusetts, and in New York City, there's a spike in cases of the flu. Now, this is going to come in two phases. And the problem that, again, goes back to the fact that it's a society at war is that there's a lot of misinformation or no information about what's really going on in the spring of 1918. Because what the Woodrow Wilson administration wanted to do was keep getting recruits, build support for the war. And one thing he did was dusted off a law, thanks to John Adams, from the 1700s, the Sedition Acts. So civil liberties went under attack during World War I, and the press was restricted in what they could say negatively. And it was meant mostly to build support or keep at least anti-war fever down. What you get is a lot of politicians and the government downplaying the spike in the flu. They're saying it's just a regular flu. It's really not much of a bigger deal. And that actually goes to the heart of why people call it the Spanish flu. Spain was neutral during World War I. In Madrid and other areas in Spain, they have huge outbreaks of the flu, but their press isn't restricted because of warfare. So a lot of the information is coming out of Madrid. So it got associated as the Spanish flu for that reason, but at least good evidence shows it started in the American Midwest. Now, two problems that this now is going to exacerbate. Soldiers are being moved around from fort to fort. They're being put on train cars, poor ventilation, very close quarters. They're spreading this amongst themselves. And then as they're being sent over to France in the summer of 1918, they're taking this flu with them. And it's going to spread like wildfire throughout the armies as well as the war is going on. And what happens is the flu comes in two waves. It's the spring wave, but then it comes back in a much more brutal way in the fall. And you tie that with misinformation and really not taking it seriously, and it leads to disaster, both with the military and also in the United States. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen the article that's being passed around about flatten the curve. Then the two examples from this, what people call the Spanish flu in St. Louis, when they canceled a parade in support of the war, and then one in Philadelphia where they didn't. And what happens in Philadelphia is you have 200,000 people in September 1918 who come out to support the war for Liberty loans. And Liberty loans were a good way to finance the war, but also to help as propaganda to get people to support it. And when they don't cancel it, it's disaster for the city of Philadelphia. The cases spread like crazy, and this is a much more violent form of the flu. And the causes of it, again, you can't ignore what's taking place. Also, you can't ignore who's actually being targeted the most, where again, typically the flu goes more towards the elderly or those already sick. This flu in 1918 is targeting people from 20 to 40. Again, the more I read about this, the more I was using hand sanitizer and freaking out while I was doing this research. So that is not common. And Jake, you might know better. I don't know if this is a correlation between how many soldiers are catching it and the virus mutating because of that, or if this is just bad luck that it's 20 to 40. I don't really know about that. But the symptoms, again, are not regular flu-like symptoms. You get reports of anyone who has this, they start bleeding from the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the nose. If you look at your wrist right now and you see that blue vein that's running through it, a lot of medical professionals noted people's faces turn that color due to lack of oxygen, so much that you couldn't even differentiate skin color. And the reports of this are just absolutely devastating in terms of the lack of supplies to handle such a devastating flu, the death rate, and just the vivid descriptions of what really happens. There's a nurse who is in the Navy, and she reported how people's lungs, after they get pneumonia trying to fight this off, would fill up so much with fluid, it would rupture their lungs and puncture holes in those lungs. And when they would turn soldiers over onto their sides, it would make a crackling noise. And the nurse had mentioned that this noise made her think of Rice Krispies. And for the rest of her life, it was such a traumatizing noise that she heard from these soldiers' lungs that she could never be around Rice Krispies again, because it brought back these memories of her as a nurse in the Navy. And the medical professionals write about how this is even worse than what you're seeing on the Western Front over in France, which is, again, devastating on a scale really never quite seen. Someone wrote, "It is only a matter of a few hours until the death comes. It is horrible. We have lost an outrageous number of nurses and doctors. For several days, there are no coffins and bodies piled up, something fierce. It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle." Again, that was someone describing what's taking place, not from the war, but from this influenza. And whenever I give battlefield tours or talk about really battles in general, I always point out these aren't video games. These bodies aren't disappearing. Same thing happens when you have more dying than you can take really care of. So undertakers are, one, getting sick from dealing with the corpses. Grave diggers are doing the same, where they're not even willing to bury people who get this influenza. And there's a huge lack then of coffins and really what to do with corpses. And someone who owned a funeral home wrote, "We had caskets stacked up outside the funeral home. We had guards kept on them because people were stealing the caskets." And it sounds bizarre, but I mean, we're thinking, if you have people dying in your homes, where do they go when they pass away? If you have more bodies than you can bury and grave diggers not willing to bury them, what do you do with the corpses? And maybe the most influential quote when I was doing some of the research was from a woman who described their neighbors who their small child died. And what she wrote was a neighbor boy about 7 or 8 died, and they used to pick up and wrap up in a sheet and put you in a patrol wagon. So the mother and father screaming, "Let me get a macaroni box for a coffin. Macaroni of any kind of pasta, used to come in this box about 20 pounds of macaroni fit in one. And then she wrote that the parents kept saying, please, please, let me put him in the macaroni box. Don't take him away like that. Now, an hour before reading that, I had macaroni and cheese. So this really put things in perspective for me. I don't know if I can ever eat that quite the same.
Oh, Joe.
But also, it also put in perspective, things aren't too bad. I've got it pretty good, considering what people are dealing with, not just from the death, but again, having any sort of grieving process for your loved ones. And it just became a part of society. Children would play the game of using jump ropes to skip around, and they would sing, I had a little bird, its name was Enza. I opened the window and influenza. Questionable about how creative it is, but still shows that they are, as a society, trying to grasp with unprecedented death that's surrounding them. And they don't really know what's spreading it and really what they can do about it. And you see that by the numbers too, that again, it's unprecedented. There's an estimated 500 million people, which about 1/3 of the world's population, became infected with this virus in 1918 and early 1919. About 675,000 Americans catch it, and about 195,000 die from it. And I'm sure these numbers are, again, difficult to track. But again, the most jarring thing is that the highest death rate is between 15 to 34-year-olds, which died at a 20 times higher death rate in 1918 than previous years of the flu. And again, to put it in context, everyone brings up things like the bubonic plague, much more devastating than 4 years of the Black Death bubonic plague that happened in the 1300s. So again, how do you spin this? Debatable. But I think there are some things that you can point to. For one, the society did learn to cope with it, and then in a more calm fashion, take on experimentation in terms of how they even are going to go about trying to cure it. So some serums do have mixed results and some success. But again, before people freak out thinking that we're going to get a second wave of what's going on in the world right now, we're not at a war that, again, is spreading disease and putting people in close quarters. And civilians didn't properly understand what even a virus is, what that is. Still a question about how you even cure it. I guess if you're going to spin it, is that Germans caught it too. And in the final stages of the war, their offensive faults for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons is the German army is having this disease go through their camps, go through their fronts and German society. And when they start having mutinies within the German Navy, when people start going on strike throughout Germany, this is probably one factor in it where they're tired of being a devastating, war that doesn't really have any sort of end in sight. And when you add that to a pandemic going around, maybe it was another way to help maybe have the war come to a quicker conclusion for the Allied powers. That's the best way I can spin it.
It's a noble attempt. It's a noble attempt, Joe.
Yeah, you had the tough assignment here, Joe. So
they all survive it. There are medical advancements. Jake, you can probably mention that better. Like, there's a lot of failure in terms of trying to solve these things, but there are some successes too.
Yeah, so there are some, I will say, some serious parallels between what we're experiencing now and the 1918 influenza pandemic. What we're facing right now is the most disruptive medical situation that we've experienced as a global population since 1918. And also there's some similarities in terms of the ultimate result of the illness. So I cannot express enough that seasonal flu and coronavirus / COVID-19 are very, very different. But the pandemic that happened in 1918, H1N1 was the bird flu that is most likely the cause of what happened in 1918. Actually, the end results share some similarities with COVID-19, and that is that in many cases, what patients experienced is an overwhelming case of double pneumonia, and that is that idea that lungs fill with fluid. And so we are facing something similar to what they faced in 1918, and that's something to keep in mind. What we have as a difference is we understand what's going on. 100 years later, we know we can't stop it necessarily, but we can take medical measures to lessen the costs and to save lives. They didn't have respirators in 1918. And that could have probably saved a lot of lives back in those days. But we have them now. And the idea of flattening the curve, when you look at, as Joe referenced, the information and the documentation from what happened in Philadelphia versus what happened in St. Louis, Missouri in 1918, St. Louis took this seriously, and their mayor closed down all public venues. They stopped public gatherings of more than 10 to 20 people. Philadelphia didn't. And what happened is, you look at the curve, what happened in Philadelphia versus what happened in St. Louis, and it looks exactly like the maps and the graphs that we see today. Philadelphia's goes exponentially all at once, overwhelms the medical system, tens of thousands die, and then it drops off suddenly. What happens in St. Louis is it slowly builds, and ultimately the medical infrastructure was there to be able to help those patients, and ultimately save a lot of lives that would have been lost otherwise. And so we're dealing with the same situation today. So take this seriously. This is a serious situation. We can learn lessons from 1918 and apply them to ourselves today, where we can save a lot of lives if we listen to our public health officials, we listen to what our governments are saying, and those experts that know this situation best, because ultimately, situation we're facing does bear a lot of similarities with 1918, and we don't yet know fully how this disease functions. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done, but for the time being, we need to take this situation very, very seriously.
Yes, and let's also remember that it's as you point out, listen to the experts, wash your hands, and for those keeping track, don't take opium, don't take mercury. We do not advise rubbing yourself down with cayenne pepper, but we do advise staying in tune with us, because we'll be bringing back History on Tap again soon, and we'll be doing all different kinds of topics too.
Yeah, and if you got a couple minutes, we do have a couple questions. For one, and also a point, I know a lot of people have mentioned different books or things to read about these topics. What we'll do after this is we'll get together and we'll make a short reading list that covers each of the topics that we covered, if you want to look more into it. So we'll definitely get you that, and we'll put it online for you as soon as we kind of compile maybe a reading list that covers each of these four topics. But yeah, we do have two other questions that have come in throughout the time. I have no idea how to answer these, but that's why I'm relying on you all for this.
Boy.
Someone asked, did Cornwallis use infected African Americans as, quote, bioweapons at Yorktown?
Great question. I'm glad this came up. It's a charge that has been repeated since 1781. Now, what this stems out of is, as I said, beginning with Lord Dunmore in 1775 and really going throughout the war, it becomes British war policy to welcome enslaved African Americans into their ranks. You know, very similar to what you see during the Civil War. These people are coming over. They're serving as laborers. They're serving as, you know, cooks, and they call them pioneers, guys that dig entrenchments and things like that. And a lot of these people are bringing their families, women and children. And as this epidemic is raging, they're bringing smallpox with them. And towards the end of the siege at Yorktown, there are literally thousands of these formerly enslaved people cramped within the British lines, along with the soldiers, along with the civilians that are there with the army, you know, the soldiers' wives and children, you know, people who are still in the area. And as the situation becomes more and more dire, food is running out, you know, food to feed the soldiers, let alone the refugees and everyone else that's there. As the smallpox continues to take its toll, what ends up happening is the British will turn many of these formerly enslaved people out of the works, because they just do not have the infrastructure to care for them, and it's become, you know, there's no food, there's no medical care. It's the situation is become extremely dire. And what happens is the Patriot press certainly picks up on this, and you'll see soldiers actually mentioning this, that like they intentionally sent these people out to infect our army, to get us sick, as like a last ditch attempt to break this siege. There's to my knowledge, very little evidence that that was what was in Cornwallis's mind when he did it. I think the more pressing matter was, again, these are mouths to feed that he can't afford to feed. These are sick people that he can't afford to take care of. It's an inexcusable thing in many ways. I mean, these people are literally being sent back into slavery, or worse, you know. But I don't think, I've never seen anything that would indicate that it was intentionally a biological attack.
Right.
But it certainly played that way in the Patriot Press, and you can see how that would be a huge propaganda piece for them.
Propaganda for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I could add to the end of that, just because Travis mentioned a little bit about the Civil War, and I neglected to mention this in my conversation about smallpox, is that while the armies had a fairly good handle on smallpox during the Civil War, one of the most impacted communities that faces smallpox during the Civil War are refugee Black communities who are seeking protection within Union lines during the conflict, escaping from plantations in the Confederacy, seeking the protection of Union soldiers. Many of those refugees are put into camps, into refugee camps, and in many cases, the medical infrastructure in those camps was lacking. And so smallpox is going to take a big toll on those refugee populations during the Civil War, and I know we'll add this into the book list and the reading list. But there's a fantastic book on this topic called "Sick from Freedom" that I highly recommend reading.
Awesome. All right, we got one more question, and we'll see. Maybe this is where we can bring Stat Guy Mike in here. What doctor in New York had the IV fluid idea?
Let me see if I wrote it down in my notes.
Look at this ledger that Anne-Marie just pulled.
I know, you guys are showing us up here. I forgot to grab it. One of the things I wanted to bring down is I have a medical student's lecture book from the 1830s in my collection that was given to me, and it's like all of his notes from every lecture. So it's like the disease, the symptoms, the treatment, and I was going to flip through that and find some real wild stuff. Should have grabbed that.
If they're nothing else in the 1800s, they are descriptive.
Yes. Maybe I'll post some pictures to the group afterwards of some of the stuff that's in there.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the name of that New York physician here. I'll have to, if Mike can't pull it up, if it's not on one of my toolbars or on my bookmarks on my other computer, I'll get it in the reading list, because it really was. There was a book published shortly after the 1832 epidemic that talked about some of the treatments that were used at the time, and this book has testimonials from 3 different physicians in it, and 2 are Canadian and 1 is this New York physician. And there's the one New York physician, or the one Canadian physician, who says you should definitely use opium, but don't use any mercury. And the second one says use mercury, but don't use any opium. That's the worst thing you can do. And the third guy says don't use opium or mercury, but you should use this saline solution. So it's a really great example of just how confused, the medical advice was at the time between, like, does it work or doesn't it work? And even into the 1870s, there was an account of somebody it was in response to the creation of, I think, the Virginia Health Board, Health Advisory, whatever term that is, was writing in 1870 that he'd been in the valley in Virginia during the cholera outbreaks, and he bled people the whole time and it was fine. So even in the 1870s, we have people like justifying some of these antiquated procedures. It's really pretty mind-boggling.
And if there's a positive spin on all this, is that we've at least learned not to do some of these crazy things. What we'll do is that we'll find an answer, we'll add it to the book list, and any other comments and questions that we didn't get to throughout this, we will bring those in on that list too and get those questions answered if we didn't do it here. Again, Jake, thanks so much for joining us. He's from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine up in Frederick, Maryland. Again, this is our first virtual History on Tap. It's our first time doing it. We appreciate you chiming in with us, having a drink with us. We do plan on doing this again and regularly. So if you have topics you want us to cover or anything else you might want us to get into in future ones, let us know. And for sure, follow the National Museum of Civil War Medicine on social media, follow the Loudoun Museum, follow the Mosby Heritage Area. We're going to be doing this as long as we have to before we can get back out and do them at the breweries again.
Yeah, and we encourage you guys, obviously we're, with the exception of Jake, we're not in the office right now, but we're working hard to bring you guys interesting programming. Please, throw us a donation, join membership of any of our, and all of our organizations. We'd really appreciate it, and we look forward to being, back out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait to see you guys live at an event, hopefully, sometime sooner rather than later. So
we'll get there,
but not too soon.
We know how to wash hands, so that's an ultimate positive spin.
And we should probably sign off with an actual toast to your health, since that is promised in the program title.
Yeah, 100%. Stay healthy, keep following us, and we'll see you all again soon.